Buenas tardes y gracias, Andrés, por la invitación. Pero no voy a hablar en español porque cometo demasiados errores. Mis temas hoy son los errores y la culpa. Por eso hablo en inglés. Discúlpame. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to speak after the two previous speakers because I think I can say something that might unify the themes that they have already raised with you. My first experience with science in high school was in a class that was trying to teach us the beauty of the scientific method. And my teacher told us the story of the hospitals in Vienna in the 1840s, where women were dying of childbed fever at a terrific rate. In that decade alone, the rates of women's death from childbed fever ranged from 15% to as much as 30% when women were coming to be delivered by doctors in these hospitals. The women were begging for midwives. Some of the women preferred to give birth in the street rather than go into the hospital where a doctor would deliver them. What was the reason for this epidemic of childbed fever? And one physician, Ignaz Semmelweis, thought he had the answer. He observed that the doctors were coming to deliver the babies straight from the morgue where they were doing autopsies on the women who had died the day before. Well, he didn't know about germs, but he thought they must be carrying something on their hands, maybe a cadaverous poison that they were bringing from the morgue to the delivery room. So his solution was simple. He instructed his students to wash their hands. Wash their hands in a chlorine antiseptic solution. And Semmelweis's students were successful. Their women didn't die. Their death rate dropped to less than 1%. Now, what was interesting to me even at this time, our teacher wanted us to say, look at the glory of the scientific method. You see a problem, you come up with a hypothesis that might explain it, you test it, and if you're right, you could save lives. But I must have been an incipient social psychologist even then, because to me the interesting question was the response of Semmelweis's fellow doctors. Did they say, "Gracias, Ignaz, we are so happy for this information, we can now save the lives of women in labor"? No. No. Actually, they told him he could get lost and take his stupid ideas with him. What do you mean we're killing our patients? Impossible. They kept right on doing what they had been doing for the next 20 years. Well, then I grew up and I discovered, as Dan Ariely tragically discovered with his own suffering in the hospital, that the Semmelweis problem is a common problem that lives today. In the United States so far to date, more than 250 men who had been convicted of rape or murder have been released when DNA testing clearly showed that they were innocent. Clearly. Did the prosecutors who put them in prison say, "Thank God for this evidence of DNA testing. Now we can correct this terrible miscarriage of justice and moreover find the real guilty person"? Well, no. What they've decided is the guys they put away must have been guilty of something else. Those are bad people, so they didn't commit this crime, they surely committed another crime, and we will just keep them in prison until we're forced to release them. In America, parents of children with autism have formed an organization to protest the use of vaccines, which are given at about the same time that children are diagnosed with autism. And although now 8 international major studies have shown that vaccines are not the reason for autism or other diseases, and in fact that vaccines save thousands and thousands of lives, have these parents said, "Thank you for these incredible studies showing that we were wrong and that we can relax now. We didn't cause our children's autism by giving them a vaccine, and now we can find out the real cause or spend our money on treatment"? No. They've decided the studies are flawed or they're conducted by a conspiracy of the government. What does it take? What does it take? Unmistakable evidence that hand washing, DNA testing, vaccines save lives, and it's not enough to get people to say, thank you, I'm so grateful for this evidence that there's a new way of doing business, a new way of practicing medicine that will allow me to be a better doctor, prosecutor, parent, or human being. Now, at this dazzling ciudad de las ideas, the motto is, no creas todo que lo piensas. The idea I want to offer here is why it is that so many people do believe everything they think and blind themselves to evidence that what they think might be wrong. My subject is supposed to be guilt, but actually I don't find it as interesting to know why people feel guilty. Guilt is a moral emotion. It's part of our evolutionary heritage. It links us to one another. My dangerous question is, why don't people feel guilty when they should? When they've learned that they've harmed someone in their care, why don't they feel guilty? Well, the great social psychologist Leon Festinger had an explanation for this in a theory of cognitive dissonance that he developed more than 50 years ago. And this theory, I think, is going to underlie much of what our panelists will be talking about today. Dissonance is what we feel when two attitudes or a belief and a behavior conflict. You smoke, though you know it could kill you. Or you make a prediction that the world is going to end because God is unhappy with the planet, and then you learn that, in fact, here we are still muddling along. Have you ever wondered what people do when they learn their doomsday prediction is wrong? Leon Festinger did. He infiltrated a little group of doomsday believers, and what he found was that the stronger their commitment to the doomsday prediction, those who sold their houses and made a public statement that the end is nigh, how did they reduce the dissonance between I made this prediction and boy was I stupid to do that? What they did was not lose their faith in God. On the contrary, their faith was strengthened. They said, thanks to our devotion and our belief in God, God has spared the planet. One of the earliest and most famous experiments on dissonance has shown, as many experiments have, that the more time and effort and money we invest in something, the more likely we are, if we learn that it was a foolish investment, a wasteful investment, that it didn't accomplish what it was supposed to, the more likely we are to say, boy, I really spent my time, money, and effort on something important. Since Festinger's theory, more than 3,000 experiments in cognitive and social psychology have confirmed the mechanism of cognitive dissonance, even tracked it into the brain. Human beings are disposed to notice information that confirms what we believe and to ignore and minimize information that disconfirms what we believe. Our minds are designed for consonance. Now, my friend and co-author Elliot Aronson advanced Festinger's theory in a crucial way because he showed that dissonance is especially painful, it's especially motivating when an important element of our self-concept is threatened, when the information threatens how we see ourselves or when it challenges a central political or religious belief. For example, when we do something if we see ourselves as being competent and moral and kind and good, and now we get information that we've done something incompetent, maybe not so ethical, maybe not so kind, we have two ways to reduce dissonance. We can say, gracias, tesoro de mi vida, for showing me how incompetent, foolish, and cruel I've been. Forgive me, discúlpame inmediatamente. Or we tell that person where they can go with their information. Now, self-justification is not the same thing as lying to others to get off the hook. It's the way dissonance works unconsciously that allows us to lie to ourselves. Yes, as Dana Reilly has said, there are cruel, evil people in the world. But our greatest problem is not from cruel and evil people who do bad things. It is from good people who justify the bad things they do to preserve their belief that they're good people. Semmelweis's fellow doctors weren't evil, they weren't wicked, they didn't want their patients to die. It was their very view of themselves as compassionate physicians, as good doctors, that made it impossible for them to listen to the evidence that they weren't. Now, normally, reducing dissonance is a one-time thing. You make a decision for whatever reason. It's an impulsive decision. Maybe it's a thought-out decision. But once you make the decision, unless, of course, you have too many choices, once you make the decision, dissonance is likely to kick in and make you feel that your decision was the wisest and the best. But the danger, the real concern for us in our lives, politically and personally, is what happens when that first decision sets us on a path that we might not have anticipated for ourselves. Here's my first slide. So here, for example, let's imagine two students at the top of a pyramid. Fortunately, here in Mexico, you have some pyramids. You will know this one. And let us say we have two students who have the same attitude about cheating. They don't think it's good, and they don't think it's bad. It's no big deal. Now they are both taking an important exam. They blank on an answer. They need to know this answer to get a good grade. And they suddenly, each one of them, is faced with an opportunity to cheat. The student in front of them, with the one with the fabulous handwriting, makes her answer available. Cheat or don't cheat. It's an impulsive decision. One cheats, one doesn't cheat. Now, here we go. All right, now the minute they make that decision, they will need to take an action to change their attitudes to conform with the decision that they have just made, to keep their behavior and their attitudes consonant. Therefore, the one who cheated will now justify that decision by saying, cheating is not so bad, everybody cheats, please, it's no big deal. The one who didn't cheat will justify that decision too by deciding that cheating is really a far more serious crime than I had previously thought. Un error. Okay. By the time they get through justifying their feelings and their actions of what they have done, as you can see, they will have slid to the bottom of the pyramid and will have completely different views about cheating. Dana Reilly's experiments in which he induces students to cheat worries me now just a little bit, because once people cheat, they will justify that as being no big deal, and it makes it more likely that they will continue cheating in the future. This was an actual experiment that Judson Mills had done many years ago, but now just consider this metaphor of the pyramid. I want to get rid of this. Okay? Just consider this. Two people at the top of a pyramid with decisions to make: stay in a troubled marriage or not, speak out against corruption and injustice or not, follow orders to torture a prisoner or not. Whatever the decision we make, we will justify it to reduce dissonance. How do you corrupt an honest person? All you need to do is get that person to take one small step off the pyramid, and self-justification will do the rest. George Bush, confronted with evidence, impartial evidence, that the United States was using torture on terrorist suspects, including isolation, waterboarding, sexual humiliation, savage beatings. When George Bush was confronted with the evidence of torture, he said, "We do not torture, we use an alternative set of procedures." Is this playing with words? No. To Bush, if our enemies use torture, that is consonant with our beliefs that they are the bad guys, they're bad, they're inhuman, what they do is torture. If we use torture, that is dissonant with our belief that we're the good guys. It's inconceivable that we, the good guys, are doing bad things. Therefore, we do not torture. To observers, this is playing with words. To the participant, this is self-justification. This is how they sleep at night. Augusto Pinochet was asked how he sleeps at night after the thousands of people tortured and killed by his administration. Ah, he said, one always sees oneself as an angel. That's self-justification. The discomfort of dissonance may be part of how the brain naturally works to preserve our beliefs, but how we think about our mistakes, how we think about being wrong, is entirely learned. Admitting mistakes, being open to having our ideas disconfirmed, as happens at conferences like this, leads to better, life-saving ideas. Do we want doctors to wash their hands or not? Do we want better ways to treat burn victims or not? You don't have to be a scientist to think scientifically, but you do have to be willing to not believe everything you think. When Shimon Peres was Prime Minister of Israel, his friend Ronald Reagan announced that he planned to go to Bitburg, Germany, on a state visit to a cemetery where 49 Nazi officers were buried. People were furious at this decision, and so was Peres. And so when reporters asked Peres what did he think of Reagan's action, Peres said, "When a friend makes a mistake, the friend remains a friend, and the mistake remains a mistake." If we want to stop ourselves from the dangers of self-justification, we need to separate dissonant thoughts just as clearly as Peres did. We can learn to say, when I, a decent, smart, competent person, am wrong, or when I make a mistake, I'm still a decent, capable person, and the mistake remains a mistake. I accept responsibility for this. I'm going to learn from this. How do I do better in the future? Science, of course, is about probabilities. It's about how most people behave under most circumstances. But when Elliot Aronson and I wrote our book, we came to really understand the power of self-justification by reading about those rare and courageous individuals who were able to stop their slide down the pyramid and change direction. One of the greatest stories was Wayne Hale, who was launch manager at NASA, the space agency in America. In 2003, he made the decision to send the space shuttle Columbia up. The Columbia crashed, exploded, and 7 astronauts died in that explosion. Hale's first response was to justify this. I couldn't help myself. I thought I had the best information. I was doing the right thing. I'm going to pass the buck here. Of course, he felt tremendous guilt for being responsible for the deaths of his friends. But then he caught himself. He stopped in mid-slide and he wrote this memo to the entire NASA staff. I stand condemned in the court of my own conscience to be guilty of not preventing the Columbia disaster. The bottom line is I failed to understand what I was being told. I failed to stand up and be counted. Therefore, look no further. I am guilty of allowing Columbia to crash. Now imagine that you're an astronaut. Would you want your launch manager to have been the one who passed the buck and didn't take responsibility? Or would you want Wayne Hale, whom you know will do his damnedest to make sure you're safe? NASA knows the answer. Wayne Hale was promoted to manager of the Space Shuttle program. Human beings are not eager to change, but we have the ability to change. And one of the concerns I have about all of the research on how our irrational processes are built into the brain is that it conveys the message that we are powerless to change, that we are powerless to do anything with our cognitive blind spots. Well, we have blind spots when we drive, but we learn to correct for those blind spots. The ultimate correction for the tunnel vision that afflicts all of us cognitively is more light. And an appreciation of how dissonance works, of the irrational processes in our resistance to information that could improve our lives, gives us ways to override our wiring and protect ourselves from those who won't do so. I have enough time to end with one story, too, that I love. Let's imagine that a woman comes to a fabulous conference. She's a woman of a certain age. Maybe she has a little white in her hair. And the conference, that's not this conference, runs out of money, and the organizers decide to have a little auction to raise money for the conference. People can come and sell anything they want: art, books, jewels, anything. And a woman stands up and says, "Anyone who can guess what I'm holding in the palm of my hand wins a night of love with me." And from the back of the room, a man yells, "An elephant!" And she says, "Muy cerca." Close enough. And that is how I see our quest for dealing with the irrational. We may never get to perfection, but we can get closer, and sometimes close enough.